So, think about this for a second. You walk out of a movie theater after watching one of those truly transportive films, like one of those rare 2-hour stretches where the director just completely rewrites your internal gravity.
Oh, yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Right. You step out into that blinding afternoon sun, and you look around at, like, the asphalt of the parking lot and the fading paint on the lines. Your car is sitting right where you left it.
Back in the real world.
Exactly. But for a split second, the actual physical world feels suffocating. It's this really profound, sudden claustrophobia.
Yeah, but it's not a physical restriction, is it?
No, not at all. It's a restriction of reality itself.
Yeah.
It's like you've just been breathing the air of this wider, way more saturated continent, and now you are just abruptly back in a shoebox.
It's basically ontological whiplash. I mean, we spend 99% of our waking lives treating this very specific configuration of the everyday world as the absolute baseline of existence.
Right. The parking lot is the real stuff, and the feeling in the theater was just fake.
Exactly. But in that brief, disorienting transit between the two, the baseline feels suspiciously like a cage, you know? The parameters of the parking lot feel like this completely arbitrary limit imposed on consciousness.
And that momentary suspicion is basically the entire foundation for our deep dive today.
It's the core of everything we're about to unpack.
So for those of you who have been tracking with us through this massive exploration of internalism, we've systematically dismantled the architecture of our current reality. We took apart the dark room of external metaphysics.
We really tore that down. And we stared down the terrifying silence of the Fermi paradox, too, and, what it actually means for the value of consciousness.
Yeah, and we stress-tested negative utilitarianism, the hedonistic imperative, and we even broke down the continuity of the self, trying to figure out if you even survive from one second to the next.
Which was a heavy one, but, I mean, we've been building this forensic vocabulary together.
A tool set, basically.
Right, a way to understand how experience operates, how suffering fundamentally objects to its own existence from the inside, and, how we might look at the deep future without immediately sliding into naive transhumanist optimism.
Or, complete paralyzing pessimism.
Yeah.
Which is very easy to do.
Very easy.
So today we're taking all of that forensic vocabulary and we are aiming it at a single text. It's called Life Outside, Just Beyond the Dreamer's Door.
This is really the culmination of the whole internalist framework.
It really is. We are asking if there is a true structural outside to our current biological and social existence. Or, on the flip side, if this feeling of moreness, this suspicion that we were born for a wider continent, is just another trick of the light.
We need to figure out if the concept of an outside is just another castle built inside the very trap we're trying to escape, like another broken promise.
Right, because if internalism holds up, if experience itself is the terminal frame of reality, like the absolute bottom floor, we really have to account for why our current mode of experience feels so drastically underperforming.
Yeah, why does consciousness constantly feel like a shoe that is just one size too small?
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's stay right there with that raw phenomenology. The text actually calls it the ache.
The ache, yeah, such a great term for it.
We use the movie theater example, but the ache triggers in incredibly unpredictable ways. Like a visceral childhood memory just resurfaces out of nowhere. Or you're hit with the sharp physical disorientation of grief.
Or even just hearing a specific chord progression in a piece of music and it breaks you open.
Yes. In those moments, you aren't thinking, I want more money, or I want a slightly better version of this parking lot. The feeling is so much heavier than that. The feeling is, this cannot be all there is.
The distinction the text makes here is just vital. The ache is not a quantitative demand. You aren't asking for, more days added to your lifespan.
Or more dopamine hits within the current system.
Exactly. It is a qualitative suspicion. As the text frames it, the ache is not for more of life, but for life outside.
Life outside.
Yeah. It's the haunting sense that the human world, which is, organized by Darwinian scarcity, social hierarchy, biological decay, is just not the final measure of what experience can disclose.
But, the skeptic in me immediately looks at the evolutionary origins of that feeling.
Right.
Like, for millennia, we survived by constantly scanning the horizon for the next resource.
Oh, sure, the biological treadmill.
Right. Our nervous systems are literally wired for perpetual dissatisfaction. If we were completely content, our ancestors would have just sat under a tree and starved to death.
That's a very fair pushback.
Plus, we have the historical baggage of thousands of years of religion promising a literal geographical heaven just above the clouds. So isn't this ache just biological exhaust?
You mean like a glitch?
Yeah. I mean, we have these massive frontal lobes capable of simulating infinite realities, but we are tethered to these fragile, decaying bodies that have to pay rent and sleep 8 hours a night. The mismatch just seems entirely mechanical.
Well, the biological mismatch is undeniable, and to be fair, the text doesn't shy away from it at all. But reducing the ache entirely to evolutionary noise ignores the specific texture of the disclosure.
The texture, how so?
Well, when that ache hits during a piece of music, it doesn't feel like a survival mechanism glitching. It feels like a brief, accidental alignment with a deeper layer of reality.
Huh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, life outside isn't a theological heaven with pearly gates. And it isn't taking off a VR headset to find out we're in a simulation.
Right, no matrix pods.
Exactly. It is the radical proposition that consciousness is currently running through a highly compressed emergency state bottleneck. And the ache is just the friction of that compression.
Okay, to make that bottleneck visible, the text introduces this incredible metaphor, the allegory of the turtle pit.
Oh, I love this part.
Let's map this out for you guys listening because it perfectly crystallizes the geometry of our current existence. So imagine a population of conscious, highly self-aware turtles.
Okay, got them in my head.
And they are born, they live, and they die at the bottom of a massive, sheer-walled stone pit.
And the physical environment of that pit dictates their entire sociology and psychology. The bottom is incredibly cramped. It is thick with mud.
The food supply is sporadic and intensely contested. I mean, every single interaction is shadowed by the threat of violence or starvation.
It is a pure zero-sum environment. If I get the algae, you don't get the algae.
Right, so they are constantly stepping on each other's shells just to keep their heads above the mud. But the defining feature of the pit isn't the mud.
No, it's the sky.
Yes. If these turtles crane their necks upward, hundreds of feet above them, they can see a perfect circle of open sky.
And that visual access to the sky permanently destabilizes the pit because, they don't know the nature of the sky.
They don't know if it's a solid dome painted blue or some optical illusion, or if it's actually a reachable destination.
They don't know if anything exists beyond the rim. But the presence of the sky fractures their entire civilization.
Yeah, get the theological turtles, right? They immediately ritualize the sky, they build altars out of the mud, they enforce strict moral codes, and they basically insist that if you suffer quietly enough in the mud, you will magically be transported to the sky after you die.
And then on the other hand, you have the engineering turtles, the pragmatists.
The ones building the ladders.
Exactly. They spend their entire lives trying to stack themselves or build these rickety ladders out of debris, completely convinced they can mechanically bridge the gap between the mud and the rim.
And then there's the inevitable backlash to both of those groups. The pit nihilists.
Ah, the nihilists.
They look at the failed ladders and the empty altars and just declare the sky a mass hallucination. They argue that the mud is the only ontological reality.
Right. Their philosophy is basically stop looking up, stop wasting energy, and just fight ruthlessly for your scrap of algae because the pit is all there is.
But the most tragic figures in the allegory are the artists. They feel the ache most acutely.
Yeah, they gather the mud, they mix it with water, and they use the material of the pit itself to paint these desperate, beautiful approximations of the sky on the stone walls.
Wow. The allegory basically argues that every single human philosophy, every political system, and every religion is ultimately a philosophy of the pit.
Because the pit is the text's overarching metaphor for life, organized around emergency.
Emergency, that's a strong word for daily life.
But it's accurate, right? Darwinian biology is an emergency state. It is driven by absolute lack, by the constant looming threat of injury, by resource scarcity, and by the absolute inevitability of decay.
I mean, when you put it like that, yeah.
Our psychological architecture didn't evolve to perceive absolute truth. It evolved for triage.
Triage. Just passion wounds to survive another day.
Exactly. Even our highest, most celebrated moral systems are essentially defensive mechanisms. In the pit, morality is just what care looks like when it is under constant, terrifying threat.
We are constantly applying conceptual tourniquets. And because we are built for triage, our consciousness is essentially weaponized against itself.
Yes.
But here is the brutal irony of the pit, and this is where the internalist critique gets really sharp. Let's say a turtle actually pulls it off.
Okay, against all odds.
Right. A ladder actually holds. An engineered turtle climbs the sheer stone wall, drags itself over the rim, and escapes the mud.
Or, translating back to human terms, a person achieves the exact thing they believed would rescue them.
Exactly. Why is that moment almost universally followed by a profound, hollow dread. This is the trap of, is that all there is?
The arrival fallacy.
Yeah.
It is uniquely devastating because it doesn't just disappoint you, it retroactively invalidates the years of striving that kept you functioning in the pit in the first place.
The survival mechanism relied on the illusion of salvation, and the achievement destroys the illusion.
You see this play out constantly. Think about the founder who grinds for a decade, finally sells their startup for $100 million, signs the paperwork, and then wakes up the next morning feeling utterly empty.
Or the artist who spends 20 years trying to win an Oscar, finally holds the statue on stage, and realizes it's just a heavy piece of metal.
Exactly. Or the romantic who believes finding their soulmate will permanently cure their loneliness. They get married, and then realize they are still just two flawed apes sharing a bathroom.
Right. The curtain finally rises on the ultimate prize, and the mind is just met with flat tautology. The money is just numbers on a server. The job is just emails.
And the mind recoils, asking, is that all there is?
Arthur Schopenhauer mapped this exact psychological collapse in the 19th century, didn't he? I know the internalist text relies heavily on his architecture here.
It does. Schopenhauer observed this endless cycle of frantic striving, followed by crushing disappointment, and he identified the magician behind the curtain.
And the magician is hunger, or in his terminology, the will.
The magician is hunger. That immediately recontextualizes everything, doesn't it?
It really does. Because it means the object we are chasing never actually possessed the magic in the first place.
Precisely. We fixate on an object like the promotion, the partner, the award, because our internal state of deprivation projects salvation onto that object.
It's like a starving person hallucinating a banquet.
Yes. The object becomes radiant. It practically hums with the promise of the outside. But when we attain it, the specific hunger is temporarily satiated. The projector turns off.
The glow vanishes.
And the object just reverts to its mundane material reality.
So we tire of it. The baseline of dissatisfaction returns, we feel the ache again, and our brain immediately selects a new target to project the magic onto.
We chase, attain, tire, and chase again.
We are basically greyhounds chasing a mechanical rabbit that we are powering with our own legs.
That's a perfect analogy. And Schopenhauer's conclusion was notoriously bleak because of this. He argued that because the magic is generated entirely by the hallucination of our own deprivation, existence is fundamentally just a pendulum.
Swinging between pain and boredom.
Exactly. Pain when we lack the object, and boredom when we finally attain it.
Hold on, though. If we follow Schopenhauer's logic down to the bedrock, the concept of an outside isn't just physically difficult to reach, it's logically impossible.
How do you mean?
Well, if the feeling of wonder or the ache for something greater is mathematically tied to our state of lack, then life outside is a contradiction in terms. Escaping the pit just means you lose the capacity to hallucinate the sky.
Right.
The turtle gets over the rim only to find itself in a slightly larger dirt pit with a new, higher rim. If hunger is the only thing generating the illusion of salvation, how does internalism avoid total nihilism here? Is salvation even logically possible?
That is the exact trap Schopenhauer fell into. And it's where internalism executes a massive structural pivot.
Okay, I'm listening.
The internalist analysis completely agrees with Schopenhauer's diagnosis of the current biological machine, but it rejects his metaphysical conclusion. The problem isn't that enchantment itself is a lie. The problem is that under Darwinian conditions, enchantment has been captured by lack.
Captured by lack, meaning our biology hijacked wonder and basically weaponized it for survival.
Exactly. Our nervous systems are operating in a state of chronic emergency. Under conditions of scarcity, the brain cannot afford to let you experience profound significance just for the sake of it.
Right. It would be a waste of calories.
It uses the feeling of profound significance as bait to force you to mate, to gather resources, to outcompete your neighbor. Wonder is forced to pay rent to deprivation.
Oh, wow. Wonder pays rent to deprivation. So the feeling of, is that all there is? Isn't a failure of reality. It's a failure of our approach. We are trying to possess something that can only be explored.
Yes. We treat wonder as a consumable resource. We try to capture the glow, to own it as a static object, to solve the problem of our biological deficit.
But you cannot possess a disclosure. You can only participate in it.
Exactly. Schopenhauer saw that hunger was a magician and concluded that all magic is false. Internalism argues that if we could fundamentally alter the material conditions of consciousness, if we could end the emergency and remove the structural lack, wonder could exist independently.
It wouldn't need to be consumed to justify its existence.
Right.
So if the ache is real, but trying to consume it throws us into the Schopenhauerian trap. How have we historically tried to navigate this? Because looking at human history, it seems like we just ping-pong between two massive structural false
We
exits.
really do.
Let's bring in the two archetypes the text uses to illustrate this. C.S. Lewis and H.P. Lovecraft. They represent the polar extremes of misinterpreting the ache.
They are brilliant foils for one another. Let's look at the Lewis intuition first, because it is arguably the most common psychological defense mechanism against the pit.
Yeah, Lewis formulated this very famous, incredibly persuasive argument. He looked at the structure of human desire and noted a pattern. A baby feels hunger, and food exists in the universe to satisfy it.
Right.
A person feels sexual desire, and sex is a real biological function. We feel the urge to sleep, and sleep exists.
Yeah.
Therefore, Lewis argued, if a human being experiences a profound metaphysical longing for a world or a state of being that cannot be satisfied by anything in this natural universe, that longing itself must be proof that a supernatural reality actually exists.
The promised outside.
Exactly. The hunger implies the food.
It is a deeply comforting teleology. It imposes a narrative arc onto the universe where every internal tension is guaranteed a resolution.
But internalism demands far more epistemological rigor than that, doesn't it?
It does. The counterargument is brutal but completely necessary. Longing is evidence of a lack. It is not automatically evidence of a promised object.
Just because the turtle desperately wants the sky doesn't mean the universe owes the turtle a ladder.
Precisely. Evolution frequently produces vestigial desires, misfires, and psychological spandrels. Religion, particularly in its institutional dogmatic forms, seizes on the Lewis intuition to domesticate the sky.
Domesticate the sky.
Yeah, it takes this terrifying, overwhelming, fundamentally unknowable mystery of the outside and shrinks it down into comfortable providence.
It provides a map to a place that might not even exist. It says, don't worry about the overwhelming scale of the universe. The outside is run by a localized deity who looks roughly like us. Here is the specific list of moral rules you need to follow in the mud to get there, and here's exactly what the sky looks like.
It closes the field of disclosure entirely. It takes the radical openness of the ache and turns it into an instruction manual.
Yeah, it neutralizes the terror of the unknown by pretending the unknown is just a well-managed suburb of human values.
Which brings us to the exact opposite reaction. H.P. Lovecraft.
Right. Now, when most people hear Lovecraft, they think of pulp horror, tentacles, and Cthulhu. But the text elevates Lovecraft to the status of a primary philosopher. He is positioned as the ultimate philosopher of materialist reductionism.
He is the philosopher of explanation without homecoming.
That phrase, that captures the absolute chilling core of the scientific worldview when it is stripped of all aesthetic or phenomenological padding, doesn't it? Explanation without homecoming.
It really does. Lovecraft represents the trajectory of reductive materialism taken to its logical, psychological conclusion. Science is the most powerful tool the turtles have ever developed. It perfectly explains the mechanics of the pit.
Right, it tells them the precise chemical composition of the mud, the tectonic forces that shape the stone walls, and the neurological pathways that make them want to climb in the first place.
It tells them exactly how everything works, but in doing so, it aggressively flattens the wonder.
Yes. It maps the universe, but leaves consciousness existentially out in the cold. It basically informs us, with devastating accuracy, that we are an accidental chemical reaction clinging to a damp rock, hurtling through a radioactive void that does not know we are here and will not notice when we are gone.
Religion domesticates the ache. Reductive science flattens it. Lovecraft looked at this flattened, mathematically indifferent universe and realized something profound.
What did he realize?
He let the scale and the mystery of the outside return to the human mind. But because the universe is indifferent, the wonder returns exclusively as terror.
Oh, wow.
The outside isn't Lewis's loving, anthropomorphic heaven waiting to welcome us home. It is a cold, alien, non-Euclidean abyss that will casually crush our sanity just by revealing its true dimensions.
So we are caught between two humiliations. We either humiliate our intellect by retreating into the fairy tale of the domesticated sky, or we humiliate our phenomenological experience by accepting the Lovecraftian void, where our consciousness is just a meaningless cosmic joke. So how does internalism forge a third path here? How do we escape this binary? Because the stated goal of life outside in the text is wonder without mystification and explanation without exhaustion.
Right.
We want the intellectual rigor of science without the existential terror of Lovecraft. And we want the depth of the ache without the fairy tales of Lewis. How is that mechanically possible?
To understand how internalism resolves this, we have to examine how consciousness frames reality on a micro level. The text uses a brilliant, grounded, phenomenological example to illustrate how explanation doesn't have to humiliate wonder. It asks us to observe a child playing with a stick in the woods.
Okay, let's look at this stick. An adult, entirely captured by the reductive, Lovecraftian worldview, looks at the stick and immediately exhausts its reality.
Right.
The adult says, "It is a piece of dead organic matter. It is composed of cellulose and lignin. It fell from an oak tree due to wind shear." That is what it is. End of story.
The adult is practicing explanation as exhaustion. The material layer is permitted to annihilate all other potential layers of meaning.
Right. But the child picks up the stick, and through the semantic frame of play, that stick becomes determinately a sword,
Yeah.
and then a magic wand, and then a structural beam for an ant bridge.
And, crucially, the child still knows it is a piece of wood.
Yeah, but my question is, when internalism proposes this third way, are we just advocating for a strategic regression? Are we supposed to intellectually lobotomize ourselves and just pretend the universe is a magic wand so we don't succumb to cosmic dread?
No, and this is where the philosophy requires careful unpacking. The internalist text insists that the childlike mode is not a retreat into vagueness, stupidity, or hallucination.
Okay.
The child does not live in a fog of indeterminacy where nothing is real. The child is operating in a state of determinate multiplicity.
Determinate multiplicity.
Yeah.
How does a mind hold multiple seemingly contradictory frames without cognitive dissonance?
By recognizing that reductionism is a tool, not an absolute ontology. Determinate multiplicity means that a single object or a single experience can genuinely disclose multiple, completely valid layers of reality simultaneously, depending on the relation we strike up with it.
So when the adult says the stick is only cellulose, the adult is making a category error.
Yes, they are letting the scientific abstraction impersonate the whole of reality. The child, however, allows the imaginative, the aesthetic, the kinesthetic, and the material layers to coexist.
The stick is genuinely a sword within the relational architecture of play. It isn't a fake sword. Within that specific phenomenological framing, it possesses the actual properties of a sword. It can strike, it can parry, it carries narrative weight. And simultaneously, within the frame of physics, it is genuinely wood.
Manifest does not mean flattened.
Manifest does not mean flattened. That's a great way to put it.
Exactly. And this scales up to every aspect of the human experience. Science can map the exact acoustic frequencies of a cello suite. It can track the vibrations through the air and measure the neurological firing in your auditory cortex.
And evolutionary biology can explain the adaptive social function of musical play in early hominids. Neuroscience can trace the dopamine cascade that produces the physical sensation of awe.
But the internalist defense of wonder hinges on this absolute rule. Explanation is not exhaustion.
Because no single layer gets to act as the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner of the others.
Exactly. The fact that I can mathematically express an acoustic frequency does absolutely nothing to invalidate the emotional devastation I feel when a minor chord resolves.
Right. The evolutionary utility of awe as a group cohesion mechanism does not cancel out the profound, localized significance of staring at the Milky Way.
Internalism argues that these layers, the mathematical, the biological, the aesthetic, the emotional, are co-original. When we allow them to coexist without one trying to sue the others for fraud, we are briefly experiencing the architecture of life outside.
That phrase, suing each other for fraud, is so evocative.
Yeah.
But let's scale this up. Holding multiple layers of a stick in your backyard is one thing. What does this look like applied to the future of consciousness?
A much bigger question.
If this childlike mode of non-alienated determinacy scales up to an evolutionary level, what happens? Let's tie this back to David Pearce and the hedonistic imperative we covered episodes ago. Let's assume we actually do it. We use biotechnology, genetic engineering, and advanced AI to permanently suspend Darwinian selection.
Okay, assuming we pull it off.
Yeah, we abolish involuntary physical and psychological suffering. The arc of entropy is still out there. The universe is still expanding toward heat death. But locally, form and content are no longer at war. What does that phenomenological world actually feel like mechanically?
Well, the text moves into intense speculative philosophy here. It asks us to conceptualize a phenomenological world entirely devoid of urgency, a reality defined only by flow.
Only by flow.
Yeah, the specific metaphor the text uses is a cascading waterfall of colors.
A cascading waterfall of colors. I'll be honest, my immediate reaction to that is suspicion. It sounds incredibly psychedelic and more than a little dystopian. It basically sounds like wireheading.
It is meant to convey a state of dynamic, frictionless harmony, But we have to define what is absent to understand what is present.
What's absent?
Imagine an existence with zero predation,
Mm.
no desperate zero-sum resource scarcity, no physical bodies organized around the inevitability of chronic pain, disease, and degradation.
No psychological trauma that requires constant, exhausting defensive posturing just to get through the day.
Exactly.
But if you remove all that, if you remove the emergency, the threat of death, doesn't the entire structure of human meaning collapse? This is where I have to push back. If there is no emergency, there is no triage. And if there is no triage, there is no morality. Does post-moral just mean a sociopathic free-for-all?
That's the fear.
Yeah.
Are we talking about a universe where evil is just permitted because nobody can technically be hurt? Where is the friction that makes choices actually matter?
That is the most common and immediate fear regarding post-Darwinian speculation. But the internalist response redefines the parameters of the question entirely. Post-moral does not mean evil is permitted. It means evil has lost its ecological niche.
Lost its ecological niche, like an apex predator that goes extinct because the climate changed and its prey disappeared.
Exactly. To understand post-morality, we have to aggressively analyze what morality actually is inside the turtle pit. We tend to revere morality as the highest possible good, as a divine law.
Right.
But from an internalist perspective, morality is just what care looks like under conditions of extreme, unrelenting danger. Morality is a system of commands, prohibitions, guilt, sacrifice, and duty. It is a tourniquet applied to a profusely bleeding wound.
So, thou shalt not kill is a necessary rule in the pit because killing is easy, advantageous, and permanent. But it's still just a tourniquet.
Yes. And what is the logical action to take with a tourniquet once the wound is permanently healed, the artery is repaired, and the blood volume is restored?
You take the tourniquet off. If you leave it on a healed limb, you just cause necrosis.
Exactly. When the emergency ends, care doesn't vanish. It changes form. It relaxes.
Relaxes.
Without the constant threat of immense harm, care no longer needs to manifest as rigid, punitive moral rules or desperate self-sacrifice. It transforms into pure play. It becomes deep aesthetic attention, unhindered creation, and shared becoming.
Wow.
The text has a stunning line for this transition. The dance is what remains when life no longer has to argue for itself.
The dance is what remains. So morality was never the end goal. Morality, it was just the heavy iron scaffolding we needed to keep the building from collapsing while we built the dance floor.
That is a perfect way to phrase it.
But that raises an immense structural, almost logistical question. How does a mind, or an entire civilization of minds, actually maintain this cascading waterfall, this dance, without a rigid set of rules forcing everyone into place? If there is no moral mechanic constantly tuning the engine and punishing deviations, doesn't consciousness just devolve into static noise or chaotic friction?
This gets to the very core of internalist psychology. To understand how the dance sustains itself, we have to look at how exhausting ordinary life in the pit actually is. In the pit, the human mind operates almost entirely as a courtroom.
A courtroom. That feels visceral. I think everyone listening recognizes that internal architecture immediately.
Because the pit turns consciousness into endless, grinding litigation. Think about a completely mundane decision, like deciding what to do on a Tuesday evening.
Okay.
Your biological layer files a motion. Consume high caloric sugar and conserve physical energy. Watch television. Instantly, your cultural layer files a counter motion. You are wasting time. You should be working on a side hustle to increase your social capital.
Oh man, every day. Then your moral layer objects. Spending time on yourself is selfish when there is suffering in the world. You should be volunteering.
And faintly, your aesthetic layer demands. We need to experience something beautiful or we will wither.
Every single impulse is immediately cross-examined by a hostile abstraction. The layers of disclosure are locked in a perpetual civil war. We are all exhausted because our internal lawyers are billing hours 247.
And that civil war is the direct result of the emergency. In a state of scarcity, the biological drive has to suppress the aesthetic drive or you die. The moral drive has to suppress the biological drive or society collapses.
But how do we achieve life outside? How do we achieve alignment without a mechanic?
The text uses the metaphor of smearing the canvas.
Smearing the canvas. What does that mean in practice? Are we just blending everything into a gray paste? Because internalism explicitly rejects the kind of mystical unity where you just meditate until your individual personality and all distinctions vanish into a blank void.
Exactly. The void is just the dark room all over again. In life outside, the various layers, the scientific, the aesthetic, the playful, the bodily, are not erased. Instead, they're smeared across the canvas in dynamic harmony. They blend as living, shifting relations rather than competing absolutes.
So they don't disappear, they just drop their lawsuits.
The text states, "The dance begins when the layers stop suing one another for fraud."
Wow.
The scientific explanation of the exact wavelengths of a sunset no longer tries to invalidate the overwhelming aesthetic beauty of the sunset. The biological drive for pleasure no longer structurally conflicts with the ethical consideration of another being because the environment no longer pits your survival against theirs.
Which brings us directly back to one of the most difficult foundational concepts we covered early in the series.
Yeah.
Co-originality.
Yes, the co-birth of form and content. This is where the philosophy demands immense rigor. We have to acknowledge a hard truth. Distinction and determinacy, the very things that make the universe interesting, the things that allow for individual identity, art, music, and complex thought, inevitably bring the risk of friction.
Right, and friction brings the risk of suffering.
There.
You cannot have distinct, separate entities without the possibility of them colliding.
Right. If everything in the universe is just a unified, undifferentiated soup of cosmic consciousness, nobody gets hurt. But nothing beautiful ever happens either. There is no music without silence and separate notes.
Distinction is the absolute prerequisite for suffering, but it is also the absolute prerequisite for harmony. You cannot have a chord without different notes vibrating at different frequencies.
Exactly. The goal of Like Outside is to preserve the birth of distinction, to keep the different notes, but without the civil war. We want the complexity without the carnage. As the text defines it, the outside is not unity against difference. It is difference no longer forced to become conflict.
Difference no longer forced to become conflict. That is the holy grail of existence. Well, we have to ground this soaring speculative vision, because historically, whenever human beings start dreaming of a perfect outside, a paradise where all conflict is resolved, things get incredibly dark, incredibly fast.
They really do.
What are the practical dangers of chasing this internalist life outside? Utopian thinking has a terrifying historical body count.
It does, and the internalist framework is hyper-aware of this vulnerability. The dream of the outside is uniquely susceptible to becoming a nightmare.
Because the mechanism is always the same. We end up sacrificing the present to build the perfect future. You look at the radical political ideologies of the 20th century, the logic is always, just endure this gulag, just endure this engineered famine, just execute these dissidents, because we are clearing the ground for the perfect frictionless society. Doesn't the dream of the sky inevitably become an alibi for extreme cruelty down in the mud of the pit?
You are identifying the exact catastrophic failure mode of utopianism, and the text provides a stark, non-negotiable warning against it. It says, the outside becomes dangerous when it stops answering to those still inside.
That is the ultimate ethical failsafe.
It has to be. We cannot use a hypothetical post-moral future paradise to excuse or ignore present concrete suffering. If your philosophical pursuit of life outside requires you to look away from the agony of the turtles who are currently drowning in the mud, then your philosophy is no longer a liberation movement. It has become an ideology of oppression.
The layers of your grand theory have stopped answering to the valence of actual lived experience.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the core pivot of this entire deep dive, and the ultimate conclusion of this series. If internalism holds true, an absolute outside, a post-moral, suffering-free, cascading waterfall of dynamic harmony can theoretically exist.
Okay.
It does not violate the laws of physics or the structure of consciousness.
Right.
But, and this is everything, we are not damned if we don't reach a literal, galaxy-spanning cosmic empire of bliss. We don't need the supernatural heaven in the sky to validate our existence, and we don't need the dark room of absolute Lovecraftian oblivion to escape the pain. Both of those absolutes were errors.
They were errors because they assumed that current existence was entirely worthless without an absolute external salvation to justify it.
Right.
But internalism defends a radical, quiet possibility. It proposes that thusness reality, exactly as it is in a given moment, fully aligned, briefly free of emergency, can actually be enough.
But what about the reality of drift? If we achieve a localized moment of alignment, if the layers stop suing each other for an hour or a day or even a generation, doesn't it naturally fall apart? Entropy is a law of physics. The emergency always creeps back in.
Drift is real, and it is inevitable. The text defines it brilliantly. It says, drift is the pit returning without announcing itself.
Without announcing itself.
Yeah, it is the slow degradation of harmony. Play hardens into rigid ritual. Peace stagnates into restless boredom. Care subtly twists back into control. The internal lawyers wake up and the layers start suing each other again.
So life outside is just an endless, exhausting maintenance job. We are just bailing water out of a leaking boat forever.
Not exactly. This is a crucial shift in perspective. Life outside is not a final engineering problem that you solve once, lock the door, and throw away the key. It is what happens when life stops experiencing itself as an engineering problem.
Oh, that's profound.
The dance isn't a failure just because it doesn't last forever. It isn't guilty because it doesn't become God. It doesn't need to expand infinitely across the universe to be real.
So it's an asymptote.
Yeah.
We may infinitely approach the absolute perfect harmony without ever actually touching it, but the curve itself is real.
Exactly. And this is perhaps the most deeply consoling thought in the entire internalist framework. The perfection of the outside is not required for the relief of the outside to be valid. The text concludes with a profound realization. Maybe salvation is false. That does not make relief false.
Maybe salvation is false.
Definitely.
It does not make relief false. I want everyone listening to just sit with that geometry for a second. That is the synthesis of everything we've spent hours unpacking in this series.
It really is.
We started in the absolute darkest corners of pessimism, looking unblinkingly at the raw, undeniable reality of biological suffering. We dismantled the comforting illusions of external saviors and magical thinking. But we didn't end up in despair.
No, we didn't.
The ache for the outside, that claustrophobia in the parking lot after the movie, it isn't a literal map to a geographical heaven. But it isn't random, meaningless biological noise either. It is a disclosure. It is the friction of consciousness telling us that the pit is not self-justifying. It tells us that the emergency state is not the final, unalterable truth of existence.
It tells us that the civil war between our layers of experience is not structurally mandatory. The harmony of form and content, the end of the internal litigation, is a real possibility, even if it is highly localized, even if it is temporary. The capacity for the dance is built into the architecture of the mind.
And that brings us to the end of our journey today, and the end of our deep dive into internalism. I want to leave you, listening, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you step back into your own life.
Right.
We spent so much time talking about reaching clarity, about escaping the mud, looking at the sky, and figuring out the mechanics of the universe.
Right.
But what is the true tragedy of life is not that things eventually become clear, but that we mistake clarity for completion.
That is the ultimate Lovecraftian trap. We think that because we finally understand the stick is made of cellulose, we must permanently banish the sword. We think that because we understand the evolutionary neurochemistry of attachment, the romance is dead and the wonder is exhausted.
Exactly. We let the explanation humiliate the experience. So as you go about your week, look at the layers of your own life, the biological imperatives, your professional ambitions, your aesthetic desires, your moral obligations. Are they currently suing each other for fraud?
Such a great question to ask yourself.
Are you letting one layer of your reality act as an absolute dictator, humiliating the wonder of the others? Are you treating your life as an emergency triage center when there isn't actually a fire? Even if the ultimate post-moral life outside is just an asymptote, a direction we walk toward rather than a destination we arrive at, the direction still matters.
It matters immensely.
The dance doesn't have to wait for a transhumanist utopia or a genetic rewrite. It can begin today in the small, quiet, localized moments where the emergency ceases, the internal litigation stops, you look around your living room, and you realize that thusness, just this, exactly as it is, held in determinate multiplicity, is finally enough.